So welcome everybody to this first Intuition revision techniques session. My name's Kelley O'Donovan and I'm one of the tutors here at First Intuition. So what we're going to be looking at today is really thinking about how do we make things stick? Because at the end of the day, if we're trying to revise for an exam, it is about trying to get those concepts, those theories, that knowledge into our long-term memory. That's not just going to benefit us from an exam point of view, but if we can move things from our short term into our long-term memory, then it's also going to help us throughout our career. So when you're revising, you're thinking about your studies as part of your journey to become an accountant, it's really important to not just think about, I've just got to get through an exam. It's about using the techniques, understanding those techniques, so that they can stay with you for a little bit longer than just that exam day. So my session this evening is going to very much focus on memory, and it's based around a book called Making It Stick. Really, really good book that I'd highly recommend, and at the end of the slides there is a reference to it. It looks at lots of studies around how we as individuals, we as human beings, are able to get that stuff into our long-term memory. So revision techniques, or as I like to refer to, how do we make that knowledge sticky? Because if the knowledge is there, then we should be able to apply it when it comes to that exam situation. So let's think then from a student point of view about some learning tips. And it's about an appreciation of what learning is actually like. If you are going to learn something new, it is difficult, okay? So the first thing you've got to say to yourself is give yourself a little bit of credit, okay? Give yourself a little bit of praise. That significant learning, it's normal to find it challenging, okay? It's normal for it to be a little bit hard because you are asking your brain to change. And what you've got to think of is when you're doing your revision, okay, there will be some setbacks. There will be times, and I'm sure you can share with me in the chat, there have been those times where you just think, oh, just not getting it. It feels as though I'm not getting anywhere. Oh, it's just, oh, I've got that question wrong, and it feels like you failed. What you need to do is you need to change that mindset. Okay, you need to appreciate that actually those little setbacks along the way, they're actually signs of the effort that you are putting in, right? And there's sort of studies that show that people with performance goals actually unconsciously limit their potential. So if your goal and your objective is all about, oh, it's how I performed in something, right? You need to just be careful that you aren't setting yourself up for failure. If your goal is to say, I want to increase my ability at being able to, let's say, calculate accruals, right? If you reframe and rephrase to talk about increasing your ability, then you find naturally you'll start to pick ever increasing challenges and start to interpret setbacks as useful information that will help sharpen your focus. Okay? So research that's been done showed also as well that praise has the power to shape the way people respond to challenges. But when you give yourself praise and when you give other people praise, it's important that praise needs to be based on the effort they put in, not necessarily the percentage of questions that they got right or wrong. Because from the very beginning, it's important that we remember, okay, that effortful learning will change your brain. And that's what we want to happen, because we want to make sure that the learning that we're doing, okay, and when we use the term revision, you've got to think, well, actually, when you revise and you're practicing, that should be about embedding that learning, deepening that understanding of the concept that you're looking at, whether it's how to deal with variances or interpreting a set of accounts or dealing with maybe some costing analysis that you're doing. It's that first of all appreciation that if you are learning significantly, it is often challenging, it's difficult. But for learning to change that brain and for it to go into that long-term memory, it does require effort. So before you sit down and do anything to prepare yourself for an exam, okay, or even learning something new at work, it's not just about exams here. It's you've got to think about that mindset, that inner voice. Okay? If you think you can do it, or if you think you can't do it, you're right. And the amount of times I've seen students, it's not just about exams, we're talking here about lifelong learning as well. I've seen colleagues do it. I just can't do it. Oh, I'm never going to get it. You've got to change that inner voice, because if you've got that in your head, I can't do it. Yeah, you can't do it. No, you won't be able to do it. You've got to change that around and think, do you know what? I can't do it right now. But actually, those setbacks, I'm learning from those mistakes and putting the effort in. That's not a sign of me failing. So before you even get started, start thinking to yourself, I need to be striving and setting myself goals around learning rather than performance. Okay? So learning is that process of going through the effort that's required to change that brain. That's my first thing. When you go into, say, revision, we'll talk about techniques, specific techniques that you can use to get things into your memory. The first thing is getting your mindset in the right place. Okay? Thinking about what is that inner voice telling you. Change the language, change the words in which you are talking to yourself. Yeah? So, what is one of the most fundamental effective techniques to get something into our long-term memory? And we call this retrieval practice. So, what does retrieval practice mean? A retrieval practice is a technique that is shown to effectively take knowledge from that short term into that long-term memory, which you're going to need for an exam and also beyond the exam. So what does retrieval practice mean? Number one, self-quizzing instead of reading your notes. Why is self-quizzing better than just reading through your notes? What do you guys think? Tell me in the chat. Why would I argue testing yourself by having a calculating on a call or a prepayment, whatever it is, why is that better than just reading your notes around accruals and prepayments? It's going to take more effort, isn't it, George? Yeah, it's going to be more challenging trying to put it into practice. Okay? Yes, I like that. You're seeing what have you retained. Exactly. And as Laura also points, you learn more from things that you get wrong than things you get right. Exactly. What we need to be able to do is we have to be able to identify areas that we are weak at. Okay? And you cannot identify what you do not know objectively by reading your notes. And the harder you find something, the greater those long-term benefits will be. The other thing that studies show, which some of you have actually mentioned in that chat, is making errors is good for you. It's actually good for your memory to then realise, okay, right, I didn't calculate that accrual right. I didn't look at the dates correctly, or I got my double entry the wrong way round. By going through that process, not only do I know, at the moment, I'm a little bit weak on calculating accruals. Yeah, I sometimes don't calculate my months correctly. I get my double entry round the wrong way. By making that error, you can then think, okay, right, I understand, yeah, I can see where I've gone wrong, fantastic. And next time you do it, you're more likely to be able to get it right. So we have to say to ourselves, try to remember that actually, sometimes when we get things wrong, it is actually good for you. It's part of your learning and development. And this applies in all things in life. It's not just about exams here. I say it's also about learning new things, perhaps in the workplace. Anyway, if you guys work in finance, it's always learning new stuff. So we need to remember, okay, that the harder it is, the greater the benefits. But we're doing this stuff here, okay? We're thinking about retrieval practice, thinking about self-quizzing instead of reading, identifying those areas of mastery, but it's hard work, right? And because it's hard work, we tend to not want to do it, even though it is actually a very good technique to get things into your long-term memory and identifying what you do and do not know. You cannot do that from reading a book. The issue I've got, and why students don't do it, is what does your intuition tell you to do? So you sit down and I'm going to do some revision. Your intuition is telling you, do you know what? I'm going to get that highlighter pen out. Yeah, I'm going to get those notes. I'm going to get that highlighter. I'm going to underline. I'm going to highlight the key things. Anyone do that? Oh, I love sitting down. Let's do a little highlight, little underline. Yeah. Because when you're doing that, and when you're rereading, it feels like learning, doesn't it? It feels like you're doing something. You're lulling yourself into this full sense of security that the time I'm taking to read and highlight and underline, reread again, it feels like learning. And this is the challenge, because that's what your intuition tells you to do. We've probably all been there. I know I had, definitely. But why is retrieval practice better? So why is basically quizzing, question practice, doing past exam questions, doing the question bank, doing your mock exams, that's what we're talking about here, writing your own quiz. Why is retrieval practice better? Because when you reread and you highlight, it gives this illusion of knowledge. Oh yeah, oh yes, I know that. Yes, that's very interesting. You spent this time colouring in your notes or your textbook, and you run the risk that you are eluding yourself, that you know it. Whereas if you test yourself through question practice, whether that's questions you've written yourself, that's past exam questions, whether that's questions in your training material, that is a more reliable measure. Okay, it's a more objective measure. And by doing that retrieval practice, that process of recall, okay, you've been taught the stuff, so someone's explained something to you, or you've read it initially. Every time you have to get it out of your brain to write it up into a question, that process of recall, every time you pull out that knowledge, it just helps secure it from short-term into the more medium and long-term memory part of your brain. So lots of studies show that process of recall is what you need to do to really secure and cement stuff into that long-term memory. Yeah? Which, as I said, the ideal situation is we're not just passing the exam, we're retaining some of this knowledge for our longer-term careers as well. The problem is, how does it feel sitting down and doing some quizzes or doing some past exam questions? How does it feel? Oh, it can feel frustrating. Oh, I'm getting it wrong. I don't know where to start. And therefore, it can feel less productive. I get my highlighter out. Oh, I feel as though I've really done something here. However, what you've got to remember is every time you put that effort in, you have to work hard to recall from memory something. You're strengthening that, and you're strengthening your ability to recall it in the future. So I say to students, you know what? If you've got your questions in front of you, you get really stuck and you really don't know where to even begin. Okay, go back to the course notes and try and find out. Talk to your tutor if you get stuck. But there needs to come a point within that retrieval practice where the stabilizers come off. You just have to give it a go. But you go into it going, my objective is to make an effort, to do what I can on this question. I'm not expecting initially to get it all right. And that doesn't matter. My objective isn't I can get 100% on it. My objective through my learning techniques is I need to practice recalling what I do know. And then from doing that question, I can then work out what I don't know. And then I can go back and have a look at, right, well, these bits I don't know, let's try and work out then why it is that I don't know that. Let's cement that idea. And again, if we get stuck, let's go to our tutor, let's ask for help. So big first thing is about that question practice. Yeah. And that's why Sarah makes a good point. It's like, oh, sometimes I don't feel I'm covering enough if I've only done a couple of written questions. Yeah, whereas if I've highlighted a load of notes, I feel like I've done a lot. Exactly, and that's where you've got to break that cycle. Yeah, you've got to break that cycle that it feels that if you just do 1 or 2 questions, you've been less productive. You haven't been less productive when it comes to memory. Yeah, and you need it in your memory to be able to recall it in an exam situation. Yeah. Lovely. Sonia talks about I start quizzing myself immediately. Fantastic. It is more efficient. Yeah, studies show, science shows, Sonia, that yeah, it is more efficient than rereading. Absolutely. So it's just about kind of reflecting on what you are doing at the moment. And if you have been revising, whatever technique you've been using, if you haven't been successful in the exam, something you're doing isn't working. Or even if you were successful in the exam, did you really get the grade you were truly capable of? Did you forget it all a week later, and therefore have you really embedded it for your long-term memory to help you in your future career or not? Okay. So retrieval practice is the #1 scientifically proven way to improve your long-term memory of an idea or technique or process. Okay. But it's appreciating it is not pleasant. But I compare it to going to the gym. Yeah, not pleasant, but it's good for you. Okay. Now, to make it even better, studies then go on and say that with your retrieval practice, you should actually try and space out that question practice, space out that quizzing. So spaced out retrieval practice. So this is where you need to think to yourself, right, what is my revision strategy? What's my sort of my planner of what I'm going to do when? Because I know that science tells us if we quiz at time intervals, it's even better when it comes to shifting that stuff from short-term to long-term memory. So when you're doing that question practice, when you're doing that kind of self-quizzing, yeah, or using questions that perhaps in your course materials, you want to be able to obviously link it to the learning that's already happened. Have a go at those questions. Leave it a day or so. Yeah, allow your time to actually forget stuff a tiny bit, and then come back and retest and revisit, because we keep going back to that idea of recall. Every time you have to recall something, it's strengthening that memory. The brain is like a muscle. You've got to, you ought to work it. And what's really important as well, and I think not enough students do this, is actually don't forget to revisit questions you actually got correct. Don't just go and revisit the ones you got wrong. Because actually by having that little time delay of the ones that you got right, on a Monday, well, what about on the, sort of 6-7 days later, go back to those ones you got correct and Do you get them correct again? If you do, fantastic. You know, that process of recall is now shifting it from short-term to long-term memory. Don't forget to revisit things that you've got right, rather than always focus on revisiting the questions that you've got wrong. The other thing as well is to alternate between the different study topics. Now, in accountancy, even if we were just doing one unit or one exam or one paper, I'm sure you guys know whichever qualification you're doing. You know, we've got some people here who might be doing, you know, AAT, but there could be people who are doing CIMA, ACCA, ICAEW. Yeah. One exam on its own, one unit on its own. How about you guys? Syllabus is quite large, isn't it? There's quite a lot of individual topics within one paper that you might be doing. And so if I take financial statements from AAT level 4, for example, you know, you've got single company accounts, you've got cash flows, you've got groups, you've got the individual accounting standard, you've got ratios, you've got interpretation. Now, all of those, I would argue, are sort of alternate study topics. So what I don't want to do is go, right, this week, every single day, I'm going to practice group accounts. It would actually be more effective to alternate between the different topics. So Monday, we might do groups. Tuesdays, we might do cash flows. Wednesdays, we might do single company accounts. Thursdays, ratios, and alternate between. But I said, well, I've only done groups, Kelly. I can't alternate. I've only done the groups topic. Break that down then. If I look at group accounts, I could break that down further. Profit and loss account, statement of financial position. I could alternate between those two. I could alternate between the different workings that I have to do within a set of group accounts. So don't just focus on one thing. Allow that kind of spacing out to naturally happen by alternating between different study topics. Spaced out retrieval practice though. So I'm telling you, right guys, you're going to do retrieval practice, which is question practice, which is quizzing yourself, and you're going to allow yourself time to forget it a little bit before you recall it. Your intuition is going to be screaming this at you, right? Because your intuition is going to say to you, if I just drill over the same thing over and over again, so if I just keep going over, let's say the calculation for non-controlling interests, I just keep going over and over and over and over and over, I can just burn it into my memory. I'm literally just repeating it over and over and over and over again in a short space of time. Your intuition, people will fail to see that single-minded repetitive practice. Yeah, when you do that, yeah, do you know what? You might get away with it. You might get away with it in your exam if your exam's not very far away. But what you're only ever going to do is put it into your short-term memory. Okay? It's not possible to burn stuff into that memory with sheer repetition alone. Okay? You need to space it out. And remember, we're trying to think here about long-term memory being more effective than short-term memory. So you might be able to get away with it now and again, but is it actually going to be the right thing for you, particularly if you move up from one level to the next, and then suddenly you've got a load of prior knowledge that you needed from another paper, and then all that prior knowledge is gone because you didn't do the right revision to get it from short-term into long-term memory, and suddenly this higher level paper becomes really difficult because you just can't even remember the basics. Yeah, exactly. When you get to level 4, and so I think we've got people here doing things like ICAEW as well, you know, advanced stage level. It relies on all the knowledge you've got from the lower levels. Yeah? So it's better to not do the shortcuts on the earlier stages. So why do we argue retrieval practice is better? Okay? Spacing it out. Okay? So spacing out that question practice. It allows you just to forget it just a tiny bit, not forget all of it, but just forget it a little bit. And therefore, when you do your question on, let's say, group accounts, and you haven't looked at group accounts for 48 hours since you did them in class, your brain, think of it like a muscle, it has to actually work harder then to reconstruct what you had already studied. And what that then does is it reloads it into your long-term memory. But how does it feel? Yeah, it's more difficult to do spaced out practice. Because when you just try and drill one topic over and over and over and over again, it feels like you're being more productive. And so you might get away with it from a short-term memory point of view. You'll probably create yourself a lot of stress if you're doing this the night before the exam, yeah? But you're never going to get that into that long-term memory, which is going to be a problem higher up your studies and also later on in your career potentially as well. So if we're trying to reconstruct learning from long-term memory, it's hard, it's awkward, but it strengthens it, okay? It strengthens it by doing that recall, right, through objective question practice, and ideally you want to alternate those topics and to space it out. So don't just do groups all day long, right? Think about, I'm going to do maybe half an hour of some groups. I'm then going to switch and do some ratios for half an hour. Then I'll switch, well, make sure I have a break, yeah? Right, don't ever do more than about 45 minutes or an hour in one time without a break, otherwise it becomes completely unproductive and worthless. Have a break, come back, right, let's do some question practice on a different topic area of the unit that I'm studying. So you've got to be thinking about retrieval practice, that question practice, alternating different topics. Appreciate it. It's going to feel hard, but it's good for you. It's going to get that into that long-term memory. There are some other techniques as well that you can use too to help things get into your memory, which is what is needed ultimately, I say, to pass an exam. So question practice being one of the biggest scientifically proven ways to make it stick. Okay, get that knowledge to be sticky. But there are other techniques here too. So first one is called elaboration. So when you're trying to understand and learn a new topic, to get it into your memory quickly, can you relate the material that you're studying to something that you already know? So can you see the linkages between the new concept and concepts you've already covered? So again, if you think about financial accounting, we've got the building blocks of our basic double entry. Even when you get onto more complex areas, it still comes back to that kind of fundamental principles of, you know, what's an asset, what's a liability. So can you relate what you're doing back to something that you already know? Another fantastic way to get things into your memory is having to explain the concept to somebody else. Okay. Can you explain what you are studying to somebody else? Excuse me. In your own words. If you can put the concepts that you're trying to learn into your own words, again, it's more likely to stick. So, can you write out perhaps your own notes? Yeah, where it's then in your own words, in your own flow charts. So her poor husband has to put up with her explaining things to him when she's revising. But that's a really good technique though, Sarah. So if you can explain it to somebody else, and it really does show, it really does, well, one, it shows whether you understand it or not. So it soon identifies any areas of weakness. If you go, let me explain prepayments. No, can't remember what they are. Yeah, so it's quite a good way to do that kind of identifying weaknesses, but it's also a really good way of getting things into that long-term memory. So can you explain it to someone else in your own words? You know, can you explain things that relate to what you do outside of class? So if you can see linkages between what you're studying and how it relates to a workplace situation, that also helps the brain see those connections. And if it can find effectively that additional layer of meaning and contextualization is probably a better word, right? That is also going to get into that long-term memory to stick, which is why as tutors, we try to give real-life examples. You know, we try to contextualize where we can the concepts, because the art of contextualization also helps people's memory. And I say we need it up here so we can recall it in an exam situation. Another thing that people, you know, like to do as well is can you find a sort of a metaphor or visual image that helps you remember that new material. So things, for example, we talk about how to capitalise development expenditure in financial statements. There's a mnemonic you can use called pirate, and you might picture a little pirate, right, to help you remember that mnemonic. So if you can link it to anything I do have a song as well, Sarah, that's right. If you can link it to anything that you've seen at work, that will help, right? If you can link it to an image or sort of a metaphor, any of those those linkages there will help it get into your long-term memory. And I have to actually say, as a tutor, the fact that you have to stand here and explain things to other people, that really then gets things into your long-term memory. And I kind of look back and think, I wish I kind of knew the stuff as well as I do now as a tutor compared to how I was as a student. Like, why do I have this greater understanding of the concepts? I'm pretty sure I never had this kind of level of understanding when I was a student. It's like, well, why is that? Because you have to explain it to somebody. Part of your job is explaining the concepts, trying to contextualize it into the real world, thinking of metaphors and visual tools. So that's why I can remember it. And I remember having maternity leave thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to remember how to teach this stuff? I've had a year off. But you know what? Day one back from maternity, it was all there, because the technique I'd used, it made it go into my long-term memory, because I had to explain it to someone else. I'd also done question practice as part of the revision courses. So all these techniques is why it's stuck. Yeah, I think I'll remember the accounting standards, when I'm 80. It's about trying to get it into that long-term memory. Yeah. Another good way of getting things into that long-term memory, and when you're thinking about revision and also thinking about the workplace here, is through generation. So trying to actually solve the problem yourself before being shown an answer. This is what we call experimental learning. So the process of learning by doing something rather than just reading about it. So I would do techniques, for example, where rather than teach people the formula for break-even analysis, I will give them a little scenario about a real business and try and get them to work out themselves, well, how many people do we need to sell this product to so I don't make a loss? And by solving this problem, they don't actually realise at that time they are effectively self-teaching them the concept of break-even. So this, I say, it does tie in a little bit with the idea of question practice that you can do as part of your revision. But again, even in the workplace, you can use this technique by thinking when you're training other people, can you almost let them have a go? Because if they can solve the problem themselves, it's there. It's in the long-term memory straight away. Yeah. So for revision for exams, it ties in again to the idea of question practice. But you can use that technique when you're training people in the workplace as well, and developing yourself. Yeah, rather than your manager show you, just say, hold on a minute, can I just think through this for myself? Let me just see if I can work it out. If you do that, and you need to obviously solve the problem, you'll get that straight into that long-term memory. That's what you want. You want to make it stick. Another really good technique to think about is reflection. Now, I would use reflection in all walks of life, not just for revising for exams. So it's this practice of actually just taking a moment to think, right, okay, how did that class go? How did I find that concept? How did I find that chapter? How were those questions going? And just asking yourself, okay, just on a mock exam, right, what went well? What could I have done better? Any sort of knowledge or experience this reminds me of? So that's where you might be able to then kind of link it to a workplace scenario. What do I maybe need to do so I can get better at this? What am I going to do differently next time? So it's really not enough just to do question practice on its own. Yeah. You can do your question practice, but you also need to use some of these other tools as well. So as you're doing that question, yeah, or as you're marking it afterwards, just take that little moment, take that time, just a few minutes to reflect on how that went. Did you completely muck up your time management? And did you not keep an eye on the clock? Did you spend too long going off on a tangent because it was a question about a topic area you liked and you sort of forgot to do the harder bit? But you can also use reflection, say, on any sort of technique. So whether you're trying to improve yourself as a manager, or you're trying to improve your, I don't know, communication skills, it's just that taking that sort of time to go, okay, how did that encounter go? What would I do differently next time? And again, it's all about just trying to get that brain to go, okay, right, yeah, I'll remember that next time I do X, Y, and Z. Another technique, calibration. So when we are doing our quizzes and our mock exams and our questions, we've got to remember that quizzes, practice tests are there to see whether you know as much, sorry, as typo there, as much as you think. And this is where it's really important that when you're having a go at questions, you do actually answer them. Anyone want to ever admit they've looked at a question, thought, oh, yeah, looks a bit hard, it'll take a bit of time. Yeah, oh yes, I would have been able to answer that bit, no problem. Yeah, okay, fine. Straight to the back of the answers. Yeah. Anyone want to admit they've ever done that? Had a look at the question and thought, yeah, oh yes, I would have got that right. Oh yeah, I know how to do that. And you just go straight to the answers, don't you? Oh yeah, I would have put that down. Yeah, oh yes, that would have been me. A few people are admitting to that in the chat box. Yes, I like it. So, for written questions all the time. Yes, I know you guys do. I've been there. We've all been guilty of it. I'll put my hand up. Yeah, I've been guilty of it as well. And I would tend to be guilty of it more with written questions, absolutely, rather than using a calculator. The problem is, if you do not supply the answer, or you don't have a go at it, and you just flick to the back, all you're doing is you're giving into this illusion that you know it. You've not been objective with yourself. You're creating this illusion of mastery, an illusion of knowing. The only way to truly know if you know it is to do the question without looking at the back. Yeah. And if you're looking at that question and saying to them, actually, I don't know how to answer it at all, well, great, there's your weakness identified. So what other techniques do you need to use to maybe get better at that knowledge? Do you need to take that concept, put it into your own words? You need to take that concept and explain it to some lucky person that you live with, or your pet dog or cat. Do you need to try and contextualize it to how it works in the workplace? What other techniques do you need to do? Then you come back to that question and you have a go at it without the answer there. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just creating this illusion that you know what you're doing. And then other technique that you can use is using your good old-fashioned mnemonics. Yeah. Various different ways that you can use mnemonics. You can use pictures, acronyms. There's sort of actually lots of different sort of techniques. And I've just put that image there as well, because actually the image of an elephant in children is much easier for them to recall than the word written out elephant. So, using things like pictures can really help when it comes to remembering things. So you can use acronyms. So things like, say for intangible assets, we might use the acronym PIRATE. to help us remember there's 6 different things as to why you capitalise an intangible asset. Don't worry if you're only at level 2 and you're thinking, what's that lady talking about, right? But we're talking about using, and you might like pirates, or you might have heard about smart objectives. The problem with those sort of mnemonics is they get you started, but then I often say to people, so what does the P stand for in pirate? What does the I stand for? And they go, yeah, I don't actually know what the letters stand for. Okay, so they're kind of halfway there, but they're not all the way there to fully remembering what the concept is. So they can picture the pirate himself, and they can think, oh, intangible assets, that's the picture of the pirate, but then they can't remember necessarily what the PIRATE stand for. So you can also use techniques like what we refer to as the PEG method, right? So don't worry, pirate is to do with, it's a mnemonic that you can use to remember the 6 criteria that you need to have in order to capitalise into development costs. So it's something from financial statements level 4, yeah, or IS 38 if anyone's doing that in any other accounting institute. So what I tend to do for students, they say, well, you can a mnemonic is where you take the concept, you turn it into a word to help you remember the 6 different things, but actually a better technique is something called the pegging method. So this is where if you need to remember a list of things, so in financial accounting, we need to remember a list of 6 different criteria to help us know when we have to capitalise something, capitalise our development costs. What you do instead is you say 1 bun, you picture a bun, and you have to then make a tenuous link between the bun and the thing you're trying to remember. So in the accounting concept that I use it for, we'd say 1 bun, you picture a really juicy bun, and you've got an intention to complete that bun. So one of the criteria for capitalising development costs is there has to be an intention to complete the project. So we go 1 bun, ooh, nice juicy bun, I've got an intention to complete. So what you're doing is you're pegging the rhyme and the picture to then a concept that you need to remember, right? We then go to shoe, so then you have to picture a shoe, and our tenuous link is by, you know, if I'm a cobbler, I repair shoes, and actually by repairing those shoes, that's how I make my money, and that gives me future economic benefit. And then suddenly I go 1 bun, ooh, juicy bun, intentions complete. 2 shoe, oh, I'm selling the shoes, I'm repairing the shoes, that's going to give me future economic benefit by doing so. So that's more to me what I call an advanced mnemonic. Ayana talks about dead click, exactly, dead click, used for remembering your debits and your credits. That would be an example of a mnemonic as well. They're more of a kind of like a basic mnemonic where you put it into 2 words, dead and click, to remember your debits are expenses, assets and drawings, and your credits are liabilities, income and capital. So you might have come across some mnemonics, but I say to remember a list further, one technique that people can use is called pegging. So you go 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, 4 door, 5 hive, 6 stick, 7 heaven, 8 gate, 9 wine, 10 hen. So you basically rhyme the numbers with a word, and you use that word like your hen or your tree or your shoe, and you use that picture in your mind, and you've got to create a tenuous link between the picture and the accounting concept that you're trying to remember. And this is called pegging, because you're pegging the image with the concept that you want to remember. So you hang the concept of 1 barn, ooh, juicy barn, intention to complete. That helps you remember one of the 6 things I need to under IS 38 rules around development expenditure. And you hang that on it. And the other thing that you'll see people do to get things into their long-term memory, again, if you've got a list of things you need to remember, people who count cards tend to do this as well. If you've ever seen those people where they can just memorise a whole deck of cards, is they will use things like the journey method. That's just a memory technique where, again, it's about kind of pegging and seeing images and pegging the items you want to remember on those images. So you picture a journey, it might be your journey to work, for example, and then you need to imagine basically the concept that you're trying to remember, maybe at your front door. And so again, you've got to find a tenuous link between the front door and the thing you're trying to remember. So it doesn't it doesn't work for everybody. And so I've only really found it works when I need to learn a list of things. So if I was revising for a whole of an accounting paper, I would use a whole combination of these things. I would absolutely use question practice. I would space it out. I would also try and explain the concept to somebody else. I would try and think about how this might relate to me in my workplace. I might learn a list of things using a mnemonic or a pegging technique. Now, I might try and do some things myself and solve the problem to really work out how that concept works, so like break-even analysis. So I would actually use a combination of these things. But I have to keep coming back to number one fundamental thing you absolutely have to do is objective question practice. And that means you do it without the answer, and it's hard, right? But that is the only way to get things from short-term to long-term memory. And one of the best ways to do it, in addition to some of these other techniques here as well. So if you are interested in reading more about long-term memory, so there is actually a really good book which I've referenced there, and I'll send these slides out to the guys that are registered too. And it's called Making It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, which is where these concepts here have come from. It was a book I read a number of years ago. It really just cemented to me all the stuff I've been telling students for the last 10 years was true, was correct. But I'm sure we've all fallen in some of those pitfalls. I know I have, but it's trying to change that mindset and realize it's okay if it's hard, and it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to make whoever you live with have to listen to you explaining your accounting concepts to them. So I hope that's given you a few kind of tips and techniques, or reassuring you that the technique you're using is effective. And thank you ever so much for joining me.